What was the scene when you first arrived?
So the scene when I arrived, and literally it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. My first thoughts were, this can't be happening in London. It was so different to anything I'd ever experienced. And the words I used the next morning, the unprecedented phrase, it was that. It was just like nothing I'd ever seen. And as soon as I got there, you know, I looked at the building and I was genuinely concerned for the people that we knew were in there, and concerned for the firefighters that were going in there time and time again, because the fire was so severe, and you could see as the firefighters came out, they were really working as hard as they could. So the feeling of responsibility I had was absolutely immense.
And you're obviously professional and a trained firefighter, but was there a sense of panic at all?
No, and that's one of the things that was overwhelming, was the sense of calm professionalism. And for my crews, you know, there were people there waiting to go in, and, you know, all the firefighters we had were lined up, they were waiting. There was an absolute sense of wanting to commit and wanting to get in there. But there was no disorder, there was no panic, it was all just very orderly and very professional.
What aspect of this had you not seen before in a way? What was the nature of the fire that was so different?
Just the volume of it. You know, I've been to many high-rise fires, but to see fire across so many floors, you know, involving such a large-scale building was something that I'd never experienced, and none of us ever had. So the plans to deal with that are just very different than anything we ever do. We always tackle high-rise fires from inside the building. That's the way we train, the way we practice, the way the equipment inside is laid out. But the volume of going in and tackling it on floor after floor and looking at the intensity of the fire, that was just very different than anything I'd ever seen.
And there were reports, many reports about lots of things after this particular fire, but there were reports that firefighters had gone in, thought they dealt with it in one flat, and come away again, only for the fire to take hold outside. Is that true?
Obviously, the way the fire spread was very unique. It is subject to an investigation. I've got my fire investigation team working very closely with the police to have a look at that. You know, it is very different. Normally, when we have a fire in a high-rise, it is contained to the room or the flat of origin, and that's the way the building's designed. It's designed to be contained in that compartment for a minimum of 30 and if not 60 minutes. You know, clearly the fire on that night did not behave like that, and that's one of the main lines of inquiry that the police and the public inquiry will look into.
You say this was unprecedented in nature and scale. Were you equipped to deal with it?
London Fire Brigade, at the height of the incident, had over 70 fire engines there with all the firefighting personnel, as well as a huge range of specialist equipment and officers. Yes, we had sufficient resources there on the scene. We couldn't physically have put any more people into that building. You know, the actual nature of the building, the way they're designed, the staircase in a high-rise building is not designed for hundreds of people to be coming in and out. So, you know, more firefighters would not have been able to help tackle that blaze. The building behaved so differently. You know, it was such a challenge to us, but having more fire engines or firefighters there would not have helped.
What about this notion that you needed a taller platform, and the only tall platform that exists isn't in London? Was that a mistake? Was that a problem for your people that night?
So, as I said before, we tackle high-rise fires from inside. Our crews turned up, followed a very well-rehearsed and well-trained plan, where they have people outside who connect to the water supplies outside, crews that go into the fire. You know, we start up on the floor below so that, you know, we have people in fresh air, and then they go to the fire floor. That's a very well trained and well rehearsed, and the absolute best way of fighting a fire. We use aerial platforms, so they're either called turntable ladders, aerial ladder platforms, for a number of different reasons at different incidents. We had aerial platforms available to us. The tallest aerial platform in the world would not have helped us at that incident on that night.
Given the way the fire spread, I mean, you say that you deal with high-rise tower fires before, but this was different. So is it true to say that a taller platform, had it been there earlier, wouldn't it have helped?
It is subject to inquiry. My genuine belief is that, you know, the reason that I asked to borrow Surrey's was predominantly, one of the reasons was to allow the structural surveyor to have a look at the external parts of the building later on during the fire when it was safe to do so. To actually look at the building itself to make a decision about whether it was safe. And the easiest way to do that was from outside the building. And Surrey very kindly offered to lend us their very new equipment. You know, when London Fire Brigade purchased the aerial equipment we have now, it was a reasonable time ago. We are planning to replace ours anyway. Now the new technology means that we can have different ones, because previously ones of that height either wouldn't be able to travel down the streets of London, they're too heavy to go over bridges and down certain roads, and when they arrived at the incident they wouldn't have been able to actually get to work because it's got a vehicle base and then jacks that come out, and the majority of London streets wouldn't be able to support that. Luckily, there are new technologies that we will look at in the future, but at that moment in time, I genuinely don't believe, with the way that fire spread, that it would have made much difference.
Lots of the residents said that on the night you may have sent many fire engines, around 40, but because of access, only a couple could even get close.
So it wasn't important. The number of fire engines physically close to the building isn't important. It's the firefighters and the equipment themselves. So we only use a very small number to actually supply that water. So we had fire engines parked in all the streets around, and the firefighters and the equipment made their way to the base of the tower. We had various holding areas where we had firefighters waiting with equipment, waiting to be deployed. And then we had other areas where firefighters were being refreshed and, refreshing their equipment ready to go again. So we had sufficient resources there in absolute number.
Are you saying that nothing would have made any difference that night?
A miracle? I genuinely don't think anything available to us as firefighters in the world, anywhere in the world, will particularly have made a difference. We do need to look at it as part of the inquiry. People are coming up with all different kinds of suggestions, and there's all sorts of experts around. I think people need to let the inquiry play out. But from everything I've seen as a professional firefighter, I believe that we did the very best we could on that night.
One of the most troubling aspects, though, I'm assuming for you and your firefighters, is the stay put policy, the advice to stay put. When you look back on that night, do you have regrets about how that was implemented?
That's subject to the inquiry, and it is something I'm not going to discuss on this at the moment. Stay put advice for the vast majority of people who live in high-rise buildings is absolutely the best advice. As I went back before, talking about staircases, if we evacuated every tower block every time there was a small fire, the firefighters would never get in to put the fire out, because the staircases aren't designed to have hundreds of people coming down. And the other thing is, if you have hundreds of people coming down, opening and closing doors, it can actually help fire spread or smoke spread throughout the building.
But we know from the police that there were harrowing calls made by people 55 minutes long, an hour long, who were staying put and who subsequently died. I mean, is there anything you can say about that?
No, I genuinely can't, because that would absolutely prejudice an inquiry. What I can say very early on is that people were reporting smoke in the communal parts of the building, and that's not how a building normally behaves in fire. Had hundreds of people evacuated down early on, my firefighters would never have got into the building either, and we couldn't have got our firefighting equipment in there. The reason we have the stay put policy is because for 99% of high rises, it's absolutely the safest thing to do and the best thing to do for those people living in that high rise.
But for some of the residents of the bereaved, they said that they had phone calls from their family members who were told to stay put twice, 3 times over a period of half an hour, 3/4 of an hour.
That is subject with the police. The police have all our phone records. Obviously, all the calls into our control are recorded. The police have had access to those, and every single firefighter control officer involved will be interviewed, and the results of that will be part of the public inquiry.
And the fact that the Met Police have said that advice will be part of the criminal investigation, how do you feel about that, given what your officers went through?
I think it's absolutely right that everything that happened that night should be subject to investigation. It was such an unprecedented thing that we need to look at all aspects of it. It's not something that I or my firefighters ever want to live through again, so all aspects should be looked at to determine that we should never have that happen again in London.
What is your position now, looking forward, on that stay put policy? Would you, if you went to a high rise now, would that policy be the same, given what you've been through, given what your firefighters have been through?
Absolutely. We've had high-rise fires since then. We've advised stay put, and the members of the public have stayed put in their flat and perfectly safe and well.
Do you think it's still okay to have that policy?
Absolutely. As I said, for the majority of buildings that are built in the right way and have the right fire safety measures inside, where they've been properly looked after by the responsible people in charge of the building, it's absolutely the right advice.
You raise a number of very important points there. Proper fire safety, buildings which have been properly looked after. Given what you know now about what happened at Grenfell, about the cladding issues, insulation, what are your feelings about that?
My feelings are that there's a number of key messages I want to get across. That the responsible people, the building providers, the local authorities should be in all of their buildings conducting risk assessments. They should be looking to make sure those buildings are fit for purpose for the people living in them, and that includes making sure they've got fire doors and door closers, making sure they've got the right means available to us to fight fires. And also individuals living everywhere, you know, either in a house or in a high-rise, they've got a responsibility. Please, you know, make sure you've got working smoke alarms. That goes for everybody. If you've got friends and family, you know, there's never an excuse not to have a smoke alarm. We will come and fit them for you for free.
But in terms of fire checks, does the brigade not take any responsibility for that?
No, the responsibility for the building and itself is actually the responsibility of the local authority, the housing provider. They're the ones responsible for that. We've been going out doing additional checks to support local authorities and housing providers in the buildings that have identified as having the type of cladding that was at Grenfell Tower. But they shouldn't be waiting for us to come out. They should be proactive. They should be looking at their buildings now, because it's those risk assessments that are looking at, you know, those measures. But they should also look at the people involved, because, you know, the advice in the fire is not to use a fire lift. So housing providers should be looking at people who are, you know, less able to move around freely and making an assessment whether or not they could leave a building in the event of a fire.
Because we understand that there were people with disabilities very high up at Grenfell Tower.
I'm not aware of any of the people who actually lived in there, the details of those, but that is something the housing provider should look at as part of their risk assessment. It's about the building, but about the people as well.
And the idea that there were no sprinklers in Grenfell Tower, what do you say about that?
So London Fire Brigade has actively campaigned about sprinklers, you know, especially in buildings like schools, any buildings that are being built. You know, if you retrofit a sprinkler in a property, or if you build it in a new build, it's always, you know, going to be something that will assist in the event of a fire.
And no fire alarms in many flats?
So that's quite common as well, and that's what I say, the message I want to get across is that, you know, individual people can make sure here and now they have smoke alarms working in their property. You know, lots of people fit a smoke alarm and forget about it, and the battery might run out, or even worse, they take the battery out. You know, you can actually do a lot to make yourself safer, as well as the responsibility on the housing provider to make sure you're safe in your home.
I mean, a great deal has been talked about how regulations and fire safety checks have been watered down over the past few years. I mean, how dangerous do you think that is, given where we are now?
I think that after every major disaster like this, you know, it's absolutely right that we review things like fire safety regulation, building regulation, and I would be astounded if out of this some changes don't come along which, you know, reinforce and actually make things firmer for people. I think that's essential. I think that's demonstrated this. But I think in the here and now there are a lot of steps that housing providers and local authorities should be undertaking to keep people safe.
And you've touched on it, but the idea that a block of flats might have 1,000 fire safety doors missing, how can that happen?
That's a question that I'd like to throw back to local authorities. How can that happen? You know, people go in and out of those buildings. That should never be allowed to happen. That's a basic fire prevention means, having a fire safety door, because that stops a fire coming out of a flat and going into another flat or affecting the communal area. It should never happen in this day and age.
What a lot of people don't understand is why somewhere like Grenfell Tower had around 16 fire safety checks and was cleared. How is that possible?
That is subject to public inquiry, and I really can't talk about the work that happened beforehand.
Are you surprised by it?
I haven't seen the stats, I don't know. There's also lots of speculation about lots of things that aren't actually true, so I'm definitely not going to make a comment around that.
Tell me how your firefighters are coping after Grenfell Fire.
Well, as you can imagine, I have a lot of firefighters who saw a lot of tragedy and a lot of terrible things, and you know, we have put a lot of steps in place to provide counselling and well-being and support. A lot of the support they get from their peers and colleagues is invaluable, but I have lots of people who, you know, are suffering and will suffer into the future from things that happened that evening. For a lot of people it's a very difficult thing to recall. For a lot of people they will go through a process of remembering certain parts of it. You know, it will also react in different ways with people who've been to different incidents or had different personal life experiences. You know, I'm absolutely adamant going forward to make sure my firefighters have the best counselling and well-being available, and to actually support them through this really difficult period.
I mean, one of the most striking images on a terrible night was when your firefighters were all sitting, lying outside, having worked for hours. They'd given everything, and yet had to face the fact that more than 80 people had died. How do they cope with that?
You can imagine. I mean, I have the same feelings. You know, I was there. I was going around talking to all my firefighters, actually, you know, on the night, spending a lot of time with them. We made sure every single firefighter, before they left the incident and back to their station, had the opportunity to have a conversation with a counsellor on the night, because that's really important to me. It's something that you can't imagine. It's a very difficult thing, knowing that you have worked exceedingly hard. you've committed yourself fully to doing something, you know, but you don't expect a building to behave like that. It's a very difficult thing for people to reconcile.
And have any of the firefighters talked about having told people to stay put and acknowledged that perhaps wasn't the best advice?
No, not publicly. They are talking amongst themselves. They're talking with councillors. It's not a conversation I've had with any of my firefighters. It's something that they will discuss, obviously, as part of the interview process and part of the inquiry process. You know, colleagues will be discussing things amongst each other, as they always do as part of a kind of debrief situation. What we're encouraging all our firefighters to do is to be open to talk to councillors and not to bottle feelings up, because obviously that can lead to long-term problems in the future.
What lessons do you think the brigade has learned from this?
I think after every major fire, we always, you know, do investigations. We have a look at scenarios. We always learn. I think that we will never come away without lessons learned from every incident. And what we won't do is wait for the outcome of the investigation or the public inquiry. If at any point during the early stages and now going forward, I find something that I think we should be doing differently, or looking at policies and procedures, or looking at our equipment, we will make those changes as and when we find out. We won't wait to be told by somebody else. We will be proactive in changing anything we need to.
Do you anticipate being criticised in the public inquiry?
I think that it's inevitable that every party will always be subject to some form of criticism. I think that's the nature of an inquiry, and I think if inquiry didn't ask all the questions of all the parties, they wouldn't be doing their job, and we wouldn't be doing the job for all those people in that building if we weren't all probed into our actions and what we did. What I will do is defend the actions of my firefighters on the night, because, you know, they work very, very hard, and individual criticism against any of them, you know, would be a very difficult thing for me to deal with, because, you know, they could not have given any more of themselves on that night.
But as a brigade, as a service, you would accept criticisms made of you. You anticipate in some areas to be criticised, for example, the stay put advice?
I would always expect us to be asked difficult and searching questions. If we weren't being asked them, you know, people wouldn't be doing their job. So anything that people want to ask, discuss, you know, criticise, however you word it, then we will deal with that. And where there's things we need to take action, if there are, we definitely will do.
And you know, from having been on the ground, that there's an awful lot of anger, quite understandably, about lots of things. There's a lot of grief. The fire service doesn't escape entirely from criticisms being made on the ground, from theories about how they should or shouldn't have done things. What would you say to the people living in and around Grenfell, the bereaved? What message would you give to them?
I suppose the main message to them is how very sorry we are for their loss and for being involved in such a terrible tragedy. You know, your words can't ever express to people how awful that is. You know, people involved directly in the block, people in the local area, it's affected the whole community. You know, your hearts go out to them. You can understand people's frustrations. I can understand if people feel anger. You know, I can understand that people want to be cross, they want to level criticism at people. Why wouldn't you? They've lost loved ones, they've lost their homes in the very worst of circumstances, you know, and I don't take that personally. I know that we did the very best we could on the night, but people will always want more, they want more answers, and at the moment it seems like a horribly slow process for them, you know, and when there's a void and there's no one telling them information, people become more angry and more distressed, and I understand that.
And you personally, how have you dealt with this?
That's an interesting question. I've not had time to stop yet. You know, the last 4 weeks have been full on, very busy. You know, I take immense solace in the fact that I have the most amazing professional people who work for me and with me. The support we have had has been overwhelming from the public, from other fire and rescue services. You know, the letters of thanks we've received has been, you know, really, really something that's bolstered a lot of people. I haven't taken time to stop yet. At some point I'll have to, but it's just been so busy at the moment.
But it must have hurt watching this.
You couldn't be human and not have it affect you. You know, you couldn't be a firefighter for 29 years and not turn up to a terrible tragedy and not be personally affected by it. Of course I am. You know, it's something I find very difficult, because knowing those people in that building is a terribly, terribly difficult thing to have experienced and been part of.
And just looking ahead, what lessons do you think have been learnt across the board?
I think
should have been learnt?
I think it's too early to say what lessons have been learned. I think that the inspections we're doing now with regard to the buildings, you know, I think there's some stuff there that people need to be very proactive now about making sure that buildings are safe, about risk assessments for buildings, about making sure that, you know, the adequate provisions are provided for those people in buildings. I think there'll be a lot of lessons that come out of it, and it's too early to judge any of those. And actually what's really difficult now is if people make snap judgments now, then people hang on to those. And you know, we've found from lots of other instances, if you tell people a small piece of information that turns out not to be true later or wasn't a part of something, people get really angry. So I think the speculation, all the theories, all the professional experts so-called that have come out of the woodwork aren't actually helping those people who are grieving and trying to deal with a difficult situation. And I know that people want to have a story and they want to have something to say, but people need to stop and reflect about what that's actually doing to the people involved, because we don't know the answers at the moment. There'll be a huge amount of work to find out those answers. It's really important we do that in the right way to get the right information to actually get some sort of closure for those people.
Dany Cotton, thank you very much.